Eb Cade's mouth tasted like metal when he woke up on April 10, 1945, but he assumed that was from the morphine. The car accident had been bad. His left leg was shattered in multiple places, his arm broken, ribs cracked. When the doctors at Oak Ridge Hospital told him they needed to run some tests, he didn't question it. Why would he? He was a construction worker who'd been helping build something important for the war effort in Tennessee. The doctors were there to help him heal. What Eb Cade didn't know was that 15 minutes earlier, a doctor had injected 4.7 micrograms of plutonium directly into his bloodstream. He didn't know that this was 41 times the amount scientists considered lethal. He didn't know his name had been replaced with a code, HP-12, where HP stood for human product. He didn't know that over the next 3 weeks, doctors would collect his urine, his feces, samples of his bone. He didn't know they'd extract 15 of his teeth to study plutonium absorption in dental tissue. Most of all, he didn't know that he would never fully heal, and that the real purpose of his hospitalization had nothing to do with fixing his broken bones. The Manhattan Project is one of the most documented scientific endeavors in human history. We know the names of the lead scientists. We know the locations of the secret cities. We know the exact moment the first atomic bomb detonated in the New Mexico desert. What we don't know, or what we've chosen not to remember, are the thousands of people like Eb Cade who became the project's invisible casualties. They weren't soldiers who died in combat. They weren't civilians killed in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were Americans, working in factories and living in towns, who were exposed to radiation without their knowledge, without their consent, and often without their survival. The official story of the Manhattan Project begins in August 1942, when the United States Army Corps of Engineers established a program to develop an atomic weapon before Nazi Germany could. The unofficial story begins earlier, in the late 1930s, when physicists first understood that splitting uranium atoms could release unprecedented energy. By 1940, refugee scientists from Europe were warning President Roosevelt that Hitler's regime had already begun atomic research. The fear was existential. If Nazi Germany developed a nuclear weapon first, the war would be over before it truly began. So the United States committed to a project of almost unimaginable scale. Within 3 years, the government would spend $2 billion, employ 130,000 workers, and construct entire cities in remote locations across the country. The secrecy was absolute. Workers signed oaths promising they wouldn't discuss their jobs, even with their spouses. Mail was censored. Travel was restricted. The cities themselves had no official names, just designations. Site X in Tennessee, Site W in Washington, Site Y in New Mexico. But here's what makes the Manhattan Project different from other wartime programs. Most of the people working on it had no idea what they were building. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, women sat at massive electromagnetic calutrons, adjusting dials to separate uranium isotopes. They weren't told they were handling uranium. They weren't told the dials they were turning would eventually determine the purity of the material inside the first atomic bombs. They were just told to keep the needles in the green zone and not ask questions. Some of them worked there for 3 years before learning what they'd been doing. The woman operating Panel 6 at the Y-12 facility in Oak Ridge noticed the yellow powder first. It settled on everything: the equipment, the floors, her uniform. At the end of each shift, she'd shake out her clothes and watch the fine dust scatter in the light. The supervisors told her it was harmless. They called it tuballoy, which sounded industrial and safe. What they didn't tell her was that she was shaking uranium dust out of her clothing, breathing it into her lungs, carrying trace amounts home on her skin. What they didn't tell her was that the yellow powder would be linked to cancer clusters among Y-12 workers decades later. The culture of secrecy created a strange psychological reality. Workers knew they were contributing to something important, something that might end the war, but they couldn't talk about the specifics. Soldiers could write letters home describing the landscape of Europe or the Pacific. These workers couldn't even tell their families where they lived. Oak Ridge wasn't on any maps. The town had 75,000 residents at its peak, but officially it didn't exist. If you asked someone where they worked, the approved answer was Clinton Engineering Works, which meant nothing to anyone outside the project. In Hanford, Washington, the situation was even more isolated. The government had chosen a remote stretch of desert along the Columbia River, specifically because it was far from any major population centers. What emerged there was the B reactor, the world's first large-scale plutonium production reactor. The workers who built it were told they were constructing an industrial facility related to the war effort. The workers who operated it stood feet away from nuclear reactions that had never occurred outside of laboratory experiments. They wore badges that measured their radiation exposure, but nobody explained what the measurements meant or what levels were dangerous. The first signs that something was wrong appeared gradually. A machinist at Oak Ridge developed mysterious burns on his hands. The medical staff couldn't explain them. His work involved polishing uranium components, but he'd been told the material was safe. The burns wouldn't heal. Within 6 months, his hands were covered in lesions that looked like severe chemical burns, except he hadn't been working with any known caustic chemicals. The company doctor diagnosed it as dermatitis of unknown origin and suggested he take a week off. The burns persisted for years. At Hanford, workers began reporting unusual fatigue. They'd complete a normal shift at the reactor, go home, and find they could barely stay awake. Some of them slept 12, 14 hours, and still woke up exhausted. The medical examinations found nothing wrong. Blood tests came back normal. The fatigue was attributed to stress, to the long hours, to the Washington weather. What the doctors didn't check for, because they didn't have the equipment or the authorization, was internal radioactive contamination. There's a particular cruelty in being harmed by something you can't see, can't smell, can't feel, until the damage is already done. Radiation doesn't announce itself. You could stand in a field of radioactive contamination and experience nothing, no warning, no pain. The effects come later, sometimes years later, in the form of cancers that are clinically indistinguishable from cancers caused by other factors. This makes radiation exposure the perfect hidden crime. By the time the victim realizes something is wrong, the causal chain is almost impossible to prove. The Manhattan Project scientists knew this. They understood radiation's delayed effects, its ability to damage DNA without immediate symptoms, its tendency to accumulate in bone tissue and organs. This knowledge created an ethical dilemma that the project leadership never adequately addressed. If they told workers the materials were dangerous, it might slow production or trigger security concerns. If they told workers the materials were safe, they were lying. The compromise they reached was to tell workers almost nothing, and to establish radiation exposure limits that were, by their own internal assessments, too high to prevent long-term health effects. An internal memo from 1943, declassified 50 years later, laid out the problem with brutal clarity. The memo noted that if the project applied the radiation exposure limits used in peacetime medical settings, they would need to hire 3 times as many workers and slow production significantly. But the war wouldn't wait. Nazi Germany had a head start on atomic research. The Soviet Union was an unknown variable. Time pressure justified risk, or so the reasoning went. The memo recommended adopting higher exposure limits for the duration of the war, with the understanding that some workers would likely develop health problems in the future. Nobody showed that memo to the workers. Nobody explained that the badge dosimeters they wore were measuring exposures that exceeded safety standards established before the war. Nobody mentioned that their exposure levels were being carefully recorded not for their own medical benefit, but to establish data about human radiation tolerance. The workers were simultaneously employees and unknowing research subjects. This dual identity became even more pronounced in the human radiation experiments that began in 1945. As the project moved toward completion, scientists faced a pressing question. If workers were accidentally exposed to plutonium, how would their bodies process it? Would it concentrate in specific organs? How quickly would it be eliminated? These weren't abstract questions. Plutonium production at Hanford involved risks of spills, contamination, inhalation. The scientists genuinely needed to understand plutonium's behavior in the human body to protect their workforce. The question was how to get that information. Animal studies provided some data, but animals metabolize materials differently than humans. The scientists needed human subjects. In a traditional medical research context, they would have recruited volunteers and obtained informed consent. But this was the Manhattan Project. Everything was classified. Recruiting volunteers would mean explaining what plutonium was, why it was dangerous, and what the government was doing with it. That was information they couldn't share. So they found another way. They identified patients in hospitals, people who were already sick or injured, people who might not survive long enough to experience radiation's long-term effects. These patients would be injected with plutonium without their knowledge. Their blood, urine, and tissue would be collected and analyzed. If they died, autopsies would be performed to track plutonium distribution in their organs. The patients would never know they'd been part of an experiment. Eb Cade was the first. Patient HP-12. He survived his initial injuries and the plutonium injection. After 3 weeks of intensive monitoring, he realized something was wrong. The doctors were too interested in his bodily functions. They asked for too many samples. They seemed disappointed when he started improving. One night, with his broken bones still on set, Eb Cade checked himself out of the hospital. He disappeared into the night, taking with him the plutonium in his bones and the secret of what had been done to him. The doctors who ran the experiment were frustrated by his escape. They'd wanted to continue monitoring him for months, possibly years. They'd wanted tissue samples from his organs. But Eb Cade had made the experiment uncontrollable by exercising the one power he still possessed, the power to leave. The scientists filed a report noting the subject's departure and moved on to the next patient. Over the next 2 years, 17 more people would be injected with plutonium in similar experiments. None of them were told. None of them consented. None of them knew they were contributing data to a scientific program that would remain classified for nearly 50 years. Eb Cade died in 1953, 8 years after his injection. The death certificate listed his cause of death as heart failure. There was no mention of the 4.7 micrograms of plutonium still circulating in his body, concentrated in his bones, slowly emitting radiation into his bone marrow where blood cells are formed. There was no mention that his 15 extracted teeth were sitting in a laboratory, labeled HP-12, part of a study on plutonium absorption in dental tissue. His family never knew. The doctors who injected him moved on to other projects, other patients, other experiments. The letter arrived at Los Alamos 3 days after Eb Cade's escape from the hospital. It came from the medical director overseeing the plutonium injection program, and it addressed a practical problem. They needed more subjects. The letter proposed expanding the program to other hospitals, other cities. It suggested identifying terminally ill patients who would die relatively quickly, limiting the project's long-term monitoring obligations. It recommended children in some cases, because children's bodies might process plutonium differently than adults. The letter ended with a request for approval and additional funding. If these kinds of historical dominoes intrigue you, the small moments that toppled ethical boundaries in the name of national security, hitting that like button helps us keep digging through the declassified archives for more stories that history tried to bury. The approval came back within a week. The program would expand, more hospitals, more patients, more data. And as 1945 turned into 1946, as the war ended and the Manhattan Project transitioned from building bombs to managing nuclear weapons stockpiles, the scope of human radiation research would expand in ways that would horrify the doctors who'd started it. But that expansion didn't happen in isolation. It happened across 3 secret cities where 130,000 workers were building a new world without fully understanding what they were handling. It happened in towns downwind from test sites where families would breathe radioactive particles for years without knowing. It happened in hospital rooms and island atolls and research facilities, all connected by a single thread: the belief that secrecy justified anything, that national security trumped individual rights, that the people in charge knew better than the people being exposed. The invisible enemy wasn't just radiation, it was the decision, made at the highest levels, that some people's bodies and health were acceptable costs for scientific progress. Eb Cade never knew the full scope of what had been done to him, but his escape from that Oak Ridge hospital represented something the scientists hadn't counted on: resistance. He walked out with broken bones and plutonium in his marrow, interrupting a scientific program that had forgotten its subjects were people. That program would continue without him, expanding across the country and eventually the world. The workers might not know what they were handling, but they could still notice the yellow dust. The patients might not be told about the injections, but they could still walk away. The communities might not be warned about the fallout, but they could still remember when their children started getting sick. The Manhattan Project succeeded in building the atomic bomb. It succeeded in ending the war. What it couldn't do was erase the human cost. That cost was recorded in medical files later marked classified, in dosimeter readings filed away and forgotten, in the bodies of workers who carried radioactive particles in their lungs without knowing it. Behind Eb Cade came others. Albert Stevens, injected with plutonium and told he had months to live, who survived for 20 years as the most radioactive human being who ever existed. Simeon Shaw, a house painter who died never knowing why his body had betrayed him. Thousands of workers at Oak Ridge and Hanford and Los Alamos, exposure badges dutifully measuring radiation levels that were never meant to keep them safe, only to record how much damage they could sustain. The scale of the Manhattan Project required 3 secret cities, but the secret it created spread far beyond those cities. It spread into hospital wards and research laboratories and small desert towns. It spread into the Pacific Ocean, where entire islands would be erased from maps after nuclear testing. The invisible enemy claimed its victims slowly, quietly, in ways that couldn't be traced back to a single moment or decision. But bodies keep their own records. Cells damaged by radiation don't heal the same way, and people who were told the materials were safe eventually connected the dots between the yellow dust on their uniforms and the tumors in their lungs. For 50 years, the Manhattan Project was remembered as a triumph of American ingenuity. What wasn't remembered were the people like Eb Cade, or the workers shaking yellow dust from their clothes, or the communities living downwind from test sites who would spend decades fighting for recognition. But secrets this big don't stay buried forever. The truth about the Manhattan Project's human cost came out in pieces, over decades, each revelation prompting new questions about what else might still be hidden. The invisible enemy was never going to stay invisible. Radiation leaves traces. Bodies remember. And the people who were treated as expendable had families who remembered them, children who asked questions, communities that noticed patterns. What comes next is understanding how this happened, how 130,000 workers built 3 cities without knowing what they were building, how entire towns existed that weren't on any maps, how the urgency of war created a culture where secrecy justified anything, where classified stamps could hide decisions that would haunt America for generations. The address on the letter simply read, P.O. Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. No street name, no building number, just a box at a post office in a city that wasn't the actual destination. The letter's recipient worked at Los Alamos, but Los Alamos didn't officially exist. Mail went to Santa Fe, 40 miles away, then traveled up a winding mountain road to a mesa that appeared on no civilian maps. This was Site Y, one of 3 cities that materialized from nothing between 1942 and 1945, built to house a project so secret that even the people living there couldn't say where they were. Los Alamos sat at 300 feet above sea level, perched on a mesa in northern New Mexico with views that stretched for miles. The location was chosen precisely for its isolation. Before the government seized the land, it had been a boys' ranch school. The buildings were rustic, the amenities minimal, the access limited to a single dirt road. When the first scientists arrived in March 1943, they found a frontier outpost that would become the intellectual center of the atomic age. The secrecy at Los Alamos operated on multiple levels. Scientists knew they were building a weapon, but compartmentalization meant that many of them understood only their specific piece of the puzzle. Theoretical physicists calculated explosive yields without necessarily knowing about the engineering challenges of bomb assembly. Chemists worked on purifying plutonium without full access to the reactor designs that produced it. The compartmentalization served 2 purposes. It protected classified information from espionage, and it protected individuals from the moral weight of the whole enterprise. But the scientists at least knew they were working on a bomb. The support staff, the wives, the children who lived at Los Alamos often had only vague notions. Conversations happened in code. Husbands told wives they were working on a special project. Wives learned not to ask questions. Children grew up thinking it was normal to have guards check your family's car every time you left town. The cognitive dissonance created a strange parallel reality, where brilliant minds pursued world-changing research while maintaining the social rhythms of an isolated mountain community. Dorothy McKibben ran the Santa Fe office that processed all incoming personnel for Los Alamos. She greeted scientists arriving from across the country and around the world, handed them their security badges, arranged their transportation up the mesa. She couldn't tell them where they were going. She couldn't explain what they'd be doing. She just smiled and said someone would meet them at 109 East Palace Avenue, and from there they'd understand. Many of the scientists later remembered her as the first friendly face they encountered in a project defined by suspicion and secrecy. The social world of Los Alamos developed its own peculiar character. Saturday night dances in the old ranch school building, hiking expeditions into the Jemez Mountains, parties where theoretical physicists argued about quantum mechanics while their children played outside. There was a collective pretense of normalcy layered over the reality that these people were building a weapon that could end human civilization. The pretense was necessary. Without it, the psychological pressure might have become unbearable. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles east, A different kind of secret city was taking shape in the hills of eastern Tennessee. Oak Ridge, designated Site X, sprawled across 59,000 acres of farmland that the government had seized through eminent domain. Families who had lived there for generations were given 90 days to leave. Their homes were demolished or repurposed. Their fields became construction sites for the most expensive single project undertaken by the United States government up to that point. Oak Ridge's population exploded from nothing to 75,000 within 2 years. It became Tennessee's fifth largest city, but it appeared on no maps, had no official name beyond the designation Clinton Engineering Works, and existed under martial law. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Multiple fences surrounded the facilities. Badges determined where you could go, what you could see, who you could talk to. The badges came in different colors: white, yellow, blue, each color granting access to different areas. A blue badge worker couldn't enter a white badge facility. Questions about why were discouraged. The electromagnetic separation facility at Oak Ridge, called Y-12, employed thousands of workers, predominantly young women. The job involved sitting at control panels for calotrons, massive electromagnetic separators that could distinguish between uranium-235 and uranium-238 based on tiny differences in atomic weight. The women didn't know they were separating uranium isotopes. They were told to keep certain dials in the green zone, to adjust settings when meters fluctuated, to maintain steady operations through 12-hour shifts. These women were selected specifically because they had limited education and wouldn't ask complicated questions. They were trained to operate the equipment without understanding the physics behind it. They became extraordinarily good at their jobs. Some of them could keep the calotrons running more efficiently than the scientists who designed the machines. But they went home each night without any idea that their dial turning was producing the enriched uranium that would fuel the Hiroshima bomb. Life in Oak Ridge had a surreal quality. The town had schools and churches and a movie theater, but it also had checkpoints and security sweeps, and a culture of enforced silence. Neighbors couldn't discuss their work. The penalty for violating secrecy oaths ranged from job loss to imprisonment. The yellow cake uranium dust appeared first in the processing facilities, but gradually spread throughout Oak Ridge. Workers brought it home on their clothes. It settled on furniture, coated surfaces with a fine powder that looked harmless. The project's medical staff knew the dust was radioactive, but workers were told it was an industrial byproduct, unpleasant but safe. Nobody mentioned that uranium emits alpha particles, that ingestion or inhalation could lead to internal contamination. A third city emerged in the desert of south-central Washington state, along a remote stretch of the Columbia River. Hanford, designated Site W, became the plutonium production center. The government seized 670 square miles of land, displacing farming communities and Native American residents. What rose in their place was a complex of nuclear reactors and chemical processing facilities designed to transmute uranium into plutonium, an element that barely existed in nature. The B reactor at Hanford was a monument to human ambition and human arrogance in equal measure. It was the world's first large-scale plutonium production reactor, a massive graphite cube honeycombed with channels where uranium slugs would be irradiated. Water from the Columbia River flowed through the reactor to cool it, then flowed back into the river carrying radioactive isotopes. The workers who built and operated the B reactor were pioneers in a technology nobody fully understood. The blue Cherenkov radiation glow from the reactor's cooling tanks fascinated the operators who saw it. Some of them joked about it, called it beautiful, didn't understand it was visible proof of radioactive decay. The Geiger counters that measured radiation in the facility clicked constantly, a background noise that workers learned to tune out. High readings were treated as equipment malfunctions rather than genuine hazards. The culture of the project emphasized production quotas and operational efficiency over safety margins that might slow the work. In September 1949, Hanford conducted an experiment that would remain classified for 40 years. Called the Green Run, it involved deliberately releasing radioactive iodine-131 into the atmosphere to test whether Soviet nuclear activities could be detected by monitoring airborne radiation. The release sent a plume of radioactive material across eastern Washington and into Oregon and Idaho. Nobody warned the communities downwind. Nobody measured the exposure levels in civilian areas. The experiment was deemed a success because it proved the detection methods worked. The human cost wasn't calculated because it wasn't part of the experimental design. The residents of Richland, the town built to house Hanford workers, lived closer to an operating nuclear reactor than any civilian population had before. They understood they were contributing to the war effort, they took pride in their work, but the dust storms that occasionally swept across the Hanford reservation, carrying particles of radioactive contamination, those went unexplained. When livestock in nearby farms showed unusual symptoms, when milk from local dairies tested positive for radioactive iodine, the information was collected by project scientists but never shared with the farmers or the public. The compartmentalization that defined Los Alamos extended to Hanford in even more extreme forms. Workers at the reactors didn't know what happened to the irradiated uranium slugs after they were removed. Workers at the chemical separation plants didn't know where the plutonium they processed was sent. Truck drivers transported sealed containers between facilities without knowing the contents. Security officers patrolled perimeters without understanding what they were protecting. The Manhattan Project functioned as a massive organism where each cell performed its function without awareness of the whole. 3 cities, 130,000 workers, a budget that exceeded $2 billion. The scale of the Manhattan Project was unprecedented, but what made it truly remarkable was how completely it remained hidden while operating at such scope. The social isolation created intense community bonds. People at Los Alamos or Oak Ridge or Hanford described feeling part of something larger than themselves. But that sense of mission came with a cost. Accepting that authorities knew things you didn't, that decisions were made without your input. For the scientists at Los Alamos, many refugees from Nazi Europe, the moral calculus seemed clear. They were racing to build a weapon before Hitler could. Ethical questions about civilian casualties and long-term radiation effects could wait until after the war was won. But here's what makes the secret cities more than just a historical curiosity. They established a template for how democratic governments could operate outside democratic norms. By claiming national security, by invoking wartime necessity, by creating parallel worlds where information flowed only downward and dissent was treated as disloyalty, the Manhattan Project showed that secrecy could be maintained at almost any scale if the penalties for breaking it were severe enough and the justifications compelling enough. The workers at Oak Ridge, shaking yellow dust from their uniforms, went home to apartments they didn't choose in a city that didn't exist on maps. They cashed paychecks from an employer whose actual purpose they couldn't name. Their children attended schools where teachers couldn't explain what their parents did for work. The normalcy was performance, a collective agreement to pretend that life in a secret city was just like life anywhere else. The scientists at Los Alamos understood more, but their knowledge brought its own burdens. Some of them, like Leo Szilard, began drafting petitions against using the bomb on civilian targets even before it was complete. Others, like Robert Oppenheimer, wrestled with the implications while pushing forward with the work. The compartmentalization of information created compartmentalization of responsibility. Who was accountable for the whole when everyone only understood their part? At Hanford, the workers operating the B reactor stood at ground zero of a new age. They were running systems that had never been tested at this scale, managing reactions that released energy on a level previously theoretical. When the reactor went critical for the first time in September 1944, the operators watched needles climb on instruments measuring phenomena that didn't have standard units. They were improvising safety protocols for a technology that redefined what safety meant. The secrecy extended beyond operational details to health information that workers desperately needed. Internal studies at Hanford tracked radiation exposure levels, documented health problems among workers, established correlations between exposure and symptoms. But the data was classified. Workers who developed mysterious illnesses couldn't access their own medical records. Doctors treating them weren't cleared to see the full history of what their patients had been exposed to. The information flow was designed to protect the project, not the people working on it. A Hanford worker named Harold McCluskey would later become known as the Atomic Man, after an accident exposed him to massive radiation. But that was decades later. In the 1940s, workers experiencing low-level chronic exposure had no such dramatic designation. They just felt tired, developed unusual symptoms, noticed their health declining in ways that couldn't be easily explained. The medical staff at Hanford documented everything, but the documentation stayed locked in files, marked classified, unavailable to the subjects of the studies, hidden from outside scrutiny. The secret cities created a parallel America where constitutional protections were suspended in the name of national security, where citizens could be monitored, restricted, exposed to hazards without their knowledge, where the price of employment was surrendering basic rights to information and informed consent. And because it all happened behind walls of secrecy, because the workers believed they were serving their country, because the war provided a compelling justification, the system functioned without significant resistance for years. But systems built on secrecy carry inherent instability. Workers compared symptoms. Families asked why certain cancers appeared at unusual rates. The walls of secrecy were formidable, but they were permeable. The question wasn't whether the truth would eventually emerge, but when. The story of Los Alamos and Oak Ridge and Hanford is often told as a triumph of American scientific capability, and it was. But it was also a demonstration of how quickly democratic norms can be suspended when authority claims sufficient justification. The workers who built those cities were told they were saving the world. And maybe they were, but the cost was paid in ways they didn't know and couldn't calculate. In the yellow dust they brought home on their clothes, in the radiation readings that were measured, but never explained, in the trust they placed in authorities who kept two sets of books. The Manhattan Project needed Los Alamos for its intellectual center, Oak Ridge for its uranium enrichment, Hanford for its plutonium production. What it created was something more. A proof that secrecy could be maintained at almost any scale when the penalties were severe enough and the justifications compelling enough. And the experiment succeeded. Not just in building the bomb, but in maintaining silence. The stories of what really happened in those cities, of the exposures and the experiments and the calculated risks imposed on unwitting populations, those stories stayed buried for decades. The workers went to their graves without knowing what they'd been exposed to. The victims of the Green Run never learned they'd been deliberately contaminated. The families downwind from Hanford drank contaminated milk, and weren't told until the damage was documented in files they couldn't access. The cities themselves have different fates now. Los Alamos continues as a national laboratory. Oak Ridge transitioned to other nuclear work. Hanford became the most contaminated nuclear site in America, a cleanup project that will take centuries. The physical locations endure, but what they represent, the choices made there, and the costs imposed on people who trusted authority, that legacy is still being reckoned with. And at the heart of that reckoning is a question the secret cities force us to confront. What does a democracy owe its citizens, even in crisis? The Manhattan Project's answer was clear: whatever serves the mission. The workers who shook yellow dust from their clothes might have answered differently, but they weren't asked. In the secret cities, asking wasn't part of the design. While these cities operated in silence, an even darker program was accelerating. The scientists had built the reactors and enriched the uranium, but they still needed to understand something fundamental: what plutonium actually did inside the human body. The experiments that would answer that question had already begun. In hospital rooms where patients like Eb Cade woke up with metal tastes in their mouths and no idea why. Albert Stevens walked into the University of California Hospital in San Francisco on May 14, 1945, believing he had stomach cancer. The doctors had shown him X-rays, pointed to shadows they said indicated a malignant tumor. They told him he had 6 months to live, maybe less. They recommended immediate surgery. Stevens, a 58-year-old house painter, trusted them completely. He had no reason not to. These were doctors at a prestigious university hospital. They were there to help him. What Albert Stevens didn't know was that he didn't have cancer. The doctors had misdiagnosed him deliberately. What he had was a gastric ulcer, painful but treatable. What the doctors wanted was a patient who would die soon, whose autopsy they could control, whose organs they could study after plutonium had circulated through his system for months. Stevens fit the requirements perfectly. On May 14th, they injected him with 131 micrograms of plutonium-238, the largest dose any human would ever receive. Then they waited to see what would happen. The human plutonium injection experiments began in April 1945 with Eb Cade and continued through 1947 with 18 subjects in total. The experiments weren't conducted by rogue scientists working in isolation. They were authorized at the highest levels of the Manhattan Project, funded by the government, coordinated across multiple hospitals. The goal was scientific: to understand how the human body metabolizes plutonium. The method was unconscionable: inject patients without their knowledge or consent, monitor them like laboratory animals, and collect data that could never be obtained through ethical research. The patients were chosen carefully. Hospital staff identified individuals who were already seriously ill, who might die before radiation's long-term effects could manifest, who wouldn't ask too many questions. Some were accident victims like Eb Cade. Others were cancer patients like Albert Stevens. A few were simply poor, hospitalized with various ailments, vulnerable to medical authority in ways that made them easy subjects for unauthorized research. Each patient received a code designation, HP12, CAL1, CHI1. The codes served dual purposes. They protected the patient's identities in research documents, and they transformed human beings into data points. It's easier to inject HP12 with 41 times the lethal dose of plutonium than it is to inject Eb Cade. The abstraction created psychological distance that made the unethical feel scientific. The injection protocol was standardized: a solution of plutonium in saline, prepared at Los Alamos or Oak Ridge, shipped to hospitals in lead-lined containers. The attending physician would administer the injection, usually intravenously, sometimes intramuscularly. Then the monitoring began. Urine and feces collected in special containers, shipped back to the laboratories for analysis. Blood drawn at regular intervals, the samples carefully tracked to measure plutonium concentrations in different organs. If the patient died, tissue samples were extracted during autopsy, cataloged, studied to determine how plutonium distributed itself in bone, liver, kidneys, lungs. The medical staff conducting these injections weren't monsters. Most of them believed they were serving a greater good. The Manhattan Project had created a new technology, one that could save countless lives by ending the war quickly. But that technology came with risks to the workers who handled radioactive materials daily. Without understanding how plutonium behaved in the human body, how could they protect those workers? Animal studies weren't sufficient. Rats and dogs metabolize materials differently than humans. They needed human data. In the urgency of the war, the pressure to produce results quickly made traditional ethical constraints feel like luxuries they couldn't afford. But here's what makes these experiments different from wartime medical research conducted by enemy nations. They continued after the war ended. The Nazi doctors who conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners were prosecuted at Nuremberg in 1947. The tribunal established the Nuremberg Code, a set of ethical principles for human experimentation that began with informed consent. Those principles became international law. And yet, American doctors continued injecting patients with plutonium through 1947, 2 years after the war's end, with full knowledge that similar experiments by German and Japanese doctors were being condemned as war crimes. The cognitive dissonance required impressive mental gymnastics. American doctors rationalized their experiments as different because the patients were already sick, because the injections weren't intended to harm them, because the knowledge gained would benefit future patients. German doctors had made similar arguments. The difference was power. Winners write the history and judge the ethics. Albert Stevens survived his injection. In fact, he survived for 20 years, dying in 1966 at age 79 from heart disease, not radiation-induced cancer. This made him scientifically invaluable and ethically damning. He became the most studied human radiation subject in history, his body tracked and measured for 2 decades, his tissue samples preserved in laboratories long after his death. The plutonium in his bones decayed slowly, emitting alpha particles that his bone marrow absorbed year after year. That he didn't develop fatal cancer was partly luck, partly the human body's remarkable resilience. It didn't make what was done to him any less of a violation. The doctors who injected Stevens maintained periodic contact with him throughout his life. They told him the injection was a treatment for his cancer, that they were monitoring his recovery. Stevens believed them. When he felt well enough to return to work, when years passed without the predicted death, he thought he'd beaten the cancer. He had no idea that there had never been cancer to beat, that his continued survival was an unexpected complication in an experiment designed to study plutonium distribution in a corpse. The research papers generated from Stevens's case were classified immediately. The data was valuable, the methodology was secret, and the ethical violations were obvious to anyone who looked closely. The papers described subject CAL1 in clinical detail: injection dose, excretion rates, tissue concentrations. They discussed the subject's remarkable longevity as a data opportunity, not a human life unexpectedly spared. The language of science provided a veneer of legitimacy to what was, stripped of jargon, assault with a radioactive substance. Simeon Shaw became patient CHI1 in April 1946. He was a house painter in Chicago, hospitalized with bone cancer. The doctors at Billings Hospital injected him with plutonium to study bone tissue absorption. Shaw died 21 days after the injection. The autopsy extracted samples from his bones, his organs, tissue from throughout his body. The samples went into freezers, into microscopes, into spectrometers that measured plutonium concentrations down to the microgram. Shaw's death certificate listed bone cancer as the cause. It didn't mention the plutonium injection that had turned his final weeks into a radioactive metabolic study. The experiment on Shaw revealed data that the scientists found encouraging. Plutonium concentrated heavily in bone tissue, exactly where they'd predicted based on animal studies. This meant that workers accidentally exposed to plutonium would carry the contamination primarily in their bones, where it would irradiate bone marrow for years, possibly decades. This information was useful for establishing safety protocols, for understanding long-term exposure risks. It was obtained by injecting a dying man without his knowledge, harvesting his organs after death, and cataloging the results in reports that emphasized scientific achievement over human cost. But here's what the scientists discovered that troubled some of them. Plutonium didn't behave quite like they'd expected. It accumulated in unexpected places, concentrated in organs at unexpected rates, persisted in the body longer than their models predicted. This meant their safety calculations were wrong. Workers at Hanford and Los Alamos who'd been exposed to what were supposedly safe levels might actually be carrying dangerous contamination. The human experiments were revealing that the theoretical safety margins were inadequate. This created a dilemma. The data suggested they needed to revise exposure limits downward, implement stricter safety protocols, possibly remove workers who'd exceeded the new thresholds. But doing so would slow production, raise questions about why the limits were changing, potentially reveal that workers had been exposed to dangerous levels while being told they were safe. The easier path was to keep the new data classified, maintain the existing protocols, and continue operating under safety limits they now knew were insufficient. Internal memos from 1946, declassified 50 years later, show exactly this debate. Scientists argued for stricter limits based on the human injection data. Project administrators pushed back, citing production needs and security concerns. The compromise they reached was typical of the Manhattan Project. Collect more data, refine the understanding, but don't change the operational protocols unless forced to by obvious health crises. The workers remained ignorant of what the human experiments had revealed about their own exposure risks. The experiments weren't limited to plutonium injections. Other radioactive materials were tested: uranium, polonium, radium. Different hospitals conducted different experiments. Rochester tested uranium compounds on patients with kidney disease. Chicago experimented with radium injections. Oak Ridge studied iodine-131 absorption. The experiments shared common features: lack of informed consent, systematic data collection, classification of results, and a persistent belief that the knowledge gained justified the methods. In some cases, the experiments involved children. At the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, administrators fed radioactive calcium to mentally disabled boys, telling them they were joining a "science club." At Vanderbilt University, pregnant women were given radioactive iron supplements to study fetal absorption, without being told the supplements were experimental. These weren't isolated incidents by individual doctors making unethical choices. They were systematic programs, funded by government agencies, conducted at prestigious institutions, designed to answer questions that peacetime ethics wouldn't permit. The justification was always the same: national security. The knowledge was necessary to protect workers, to understand weapons effects, to maintain America's nuclear advantage over the Soviet Union. And because the research was classified, because the subjects never knew they'd been experimented on, because the data went into reports that few people ever saw, the experiments continued year after year, without significant oversight or accountability. The doctors who conducted these experiments weren't all true believers. Some of them felt uncomfortable with the protocols. Some requested permission to inform patients and were told that informed consent would compromise the research. Some documented their concerns in memos that were filed away and ignored. But discomfort didn't translate into refusal. The pressure to contribute to national security, the appeal of participating in cutting-edge research, the assurance that what they were doing was necessary and would remain confidential. All of these factors made it easier to inject the next patient than to stop and question the entire enterprise. There's a particular cruelty in medical experimentation that separates it from other forms of state-sanctioned harm. Soldiers know they might be sent into danger. Workers at hazardous facilities understand, at least theoretically, that their jobs carry risks. But patients enter hospitals believing they'll be healed, or at minimum treated with care and honesty. The doctor-patient relationship is built on trust. When that trust is exploited to turn patients into unknowing research subjects, the violation cuts deeper than physical harm. It's a betrayal of the fundamental assumption that medicine exists to serve the patient's interests. Albert Stevens trusted his doctors when they told him he had cancer. Simeon Shaw trusted that his painful final weeks were being managed compassionately. Eb Cade trusted that the tests following his accident were meant to aid his recovery. That trust was weaponized against them, turned into a tool that made them compliant subjects in experiments they never agreed to participate in. The betrayal was systematic, deliberate, and protected by layers of classification that ensured the victims would never know what had been done to them. The data collected from these 18 patients, along with dozens more subjected to other radioactive material experiments, filled classified reports that shaped radiation safety standards for decades. Some of the findings were genuinely valuable. They revealed absorption rates, identified concentration patterns, demonstrated elimination pathways. This knowledge did help protect workers in the nuclear industry. But the ethical cost of obtaining that knowledge was never properly accounted for, never balanced against the scientific benefits, never subjected to the kind of scrutiny that might have prevented the experiments from happening in the first place. And throughout it all, the experiments remained invisible. The patients died without knowing. Their families grieved without understanding. The doctors published papers under pseudonyms, presented findings at classified conferences, built careers on research that couldn't withstand ethical examination. The system worked exactly as designed. Knowledge was gained, careers advanced, and the human cost remained hidden in hospital records and autopsy reports, marked with patient codes instead of names. The Manhattan Project created the atomic bomb, but these experiments revealed something darker about what the project was willing to do in pursuit of its goals. Building the bomb required physics and engineering. Understanding its effects required human subjects. And when the traditional sources of research subjects weren't available, when voluntary participation would compromise secrecy, the project simply redefined what was acceptable. Patients became experimental subjects. Consent became inconvenient. Medical ethics became obstacles to overcome rather than principles to uphold. The tragedy isn't just what happened to Albert Stevens or Simeon Shaw or Eb Cade. It's what their treatment revealed about the systems that enabled it. Systems where secrecy justified deception, where national security trumped individual rights, where smart, educated people convinced themselves that violating fundamental ethical principles was acceptable because the cause was important enough. These weren't aberrations. They were features of a project that had learned to operate outside normal constraints, that had insulated itself from accountability, that had created parallel worlds where different rules applied. As Albert Stevens lived year after year with plutonium circulating through his bones, as doctors measured and monitored him without ever telling him why, the Manhattan Project transitioned from a wartime emergency program to a permanent fixture of American governance. The experiments that began with wartime urgency continued into peacetime bureaucracy. The culture of secrecy persisted. The willingness to impose risks on unknowing populations became standard operating procedure. But the experiments in hospital rooms weren't the only populations being exposed to radiation without knowledge or consent. While doctors injected individual patients, entire communities were about to become part of a much larger experiment. The testing of nuclear weapons would move from the New Mexico desert to the Nevada test site, and the fallout would drift across towns and farms where families had no idea they were living downwind from the most powerful weapons ever created. The doctors experimenting on individual patients were establishing a template that would soon be applied on a vastly larger scale, where the experimental subjects weren't carefully selected hospital patients, but ordinary Americans who happened to live in the wrong place at the wrong time. On the morning of January 27, 1951, a 5-year-old boy in St. George, Utah, woke up to find white ash covering his backyard. It looked like snow, which was exciting because snow was rare in southern Utah's Red Rock Desert. He ran outside in his pajamas and started playing in it. His mother called him inside for breakfast. Neither of them knew that the ash was radioactive fallout from a nuclear test conducted at dawn, 140 miles northwest at the Nevada test site. Neither of them knew that the boy had just been exposed to more radiation in 20 minutes of play than most people receive in a lifetime. The Nevada test site opened in January 1951, chosen for its remoteness and its proximity to Las Vegas, where workers and observers could be housed. Between 1951 and 1962, the Atomic Energy Commission conducted 100 above-ground nuclear tests there, detonating weapons that ranged from small tactical devices to multi-megaton hydrogen bombs. The tests were spectacular, visible from Las Vegas casinos 70 miles away. Tourists gathered on hotel rooftops to watch the mushroom clouds rise. It became a macabre form of entertainment, atomic tourism in the desert. But the spectacle had a shadow. Every detonation sent radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Wind patterns carried those particles across Nevada, Utah, and Arizona. The Atomic Energy Commission tracked the fallout meticulously, mapped wind directions, predicted dispersion patterns. They knew which towns would be hit hardest. They tested anyway. The official justification was national security. America needed a nuclear arsenal to deter Soviet aggression, and developing that arsenal required testing. The unofficial calculation was simpler. The communities downwind were rural, sparsely populated, politically powerless. Their exposure was regrettable, but acceptable. St. George became known as the fallout capital of America. The town sat directly in the path of prevailing winds from the test site. Of the 100 above-ground tests, fallout from dozens of them drifted over St. George. Residents remember the ash, the metallic taste in the air after detonations, the strange sunsets colored by particles suspended in the atmosphere. Some people complained. Letters were sent to the Atomic Energy Commission, to congressional representatives, to newspapers. The responses were consistent. The tests were safe, radiation levels were within acceptable limits, there was no cause for concern. The acceptable limits were lies. Internal documents, declassified decades later, show that the Atomic Energy Commission knew the exposures exceeded their own safety thresholds. They had detailed maps showing which areas would receive dangerous doses. They monitored radiation in milk from local dairies and found concentrations of iodine-131 high enough to cause thyroid damage. They measured contamination in soil, in water, in crops. All of this data was classified. The communities being exposed weren't told what the government knew about the risks they faced. Mary Dixon was 9 years old when the testing began. She grew up in Salt Lake City, farther from the test site than St. George, but still downwind. She remembers watching the clouds from her school playground, teachers telling the children not to worry. She remembers the government films shown in classrooms, cheerful cartoons explaining that atomic energy was America's friend. She remembers the ash on her bicycle, the dust that settled on everything after tests. What she didn't know until decades later was that she'd been exposed to radioactive iodine at levels the government had classified as dangerous, even as they publicly declared them safe. Dixon developed thyroid cancer at 31. Her cancer was one of hundreds, then thousands, that appeared in communities downwind from the Nevada test site. The cancer clusters were obvious to local doctors, to families watching neighbors get sick, to anyone paying attention. But establishing causation was nearly impossible. Thyroid cancer can have multiple causes. Proving that a specific case resulted from radioactive iodine exposure requires access to exposure data that the government kept classified. The victims knew they'd been exposed. They knew the timing correlated with the tests. But knowledge isn't proof, and without proof there could be no accountability. The Atomic Energy Commission's public stance remained unchanged. The tests were safe. When cancer rates in Utah began rising noticeably in the late 1950s, the commission funded studies to investigate. The studies were designed to find no connection. Researchers were instructed to exclude certain populations, to use statistical methods that minimized apparent correlations, to emphasize natural background radiation rather than test site exposure. The conclusions were predetermined. No link could be established between the tests and the cancers. But here's what makes the Nevada test site different from the secret cities or the human experiments. The government knew exactly which communities would be exposed and roughly how much radiation they'd receive, yet they chose not to warn them or relocate them. This wasn't experimentation in the traditional sense. It was a calculated decision that some populations were expendable in service of nuclear weapons development. The difference between the downwinders and the plutonium injection patients was only scale. The plutonium experiments involved 18 people. The Nevada tests exposed hundreds of thousands. The maps tell the story. Atomic Energy Commission documents from the 1950s show fallout projections overlaid on population centers. The maps identified St. George, Cedar City, Kanab, communities across southern Utah and northern Arizona. The projections calculated expected radiation doses in REMS and Röntgens. Some projections were marked in red, indicating doses high enough to cause acute radiation sickness. The tests proceeded anyway, the maps were classified, the residents were never warned. Children were particularly vulnerable. Growing bodies absorb radioactive iodine more readily than adults. The iodine concentrates in the thyroid gland, a small organ in the neck that regulates metabolism. In children, the thyroid is still developing, making it especially susceptible to radiation damage. The Atomic Energy Commission knew this. Their internal documents discussed the heightened risk to children. They monitored iodine 131 in milk, knowing that children drank more milk than adults. They calculated pediatric exposure rates and found them alarmingly high. They classified the data and continued testing. A pediatrician in St. George noticed an unusual pattern in the late 1950s. Children were developing thyroid nodules at rates he'd never seen before. Some of the nodules were benign, but some were cancerous. He contacted the Atomic Energy Commission to report his observations. They sent investigators who interviewed patients, collected medical records, took tissue samples. Then the investigation disappeared into classified files. The doctor was told the matter was being studied. He never received results. The families of the sick children never learned that their cases had been documented by the government. cataloged as data points in a study that would remain secret for decades. The story only gets more complex from here. Entire communities transformed into unwitting test subjects, their health monitored but not protected, their exposure documented but never disclosed. Subscribe so you don't miss how this web of secrecy spread across the Pacific to islands that would be erased from maps, and if you're connecting these patterns of deception, of calculated risk imposed on powerless populations. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. The testing at Nevada wasn't the Atomic Energy Commission's only exposure of civilian populations. While families in Utah were breathing radioactive iodine, similar exposures were happening at other sites. In Colorado, workers at the Rocky Flats plutonium facility lived downwind from a plant that routinely released radioactive particles. In Washington, communities near Hanford drank water contaminated by reactor operations. The pattern repeated: exposure, documentation, classification, denial. But at least the communities near Nevada and Hanford were on the mainland. They could, theoretically, leave if they learned about the risks. They had some political recourse, some possibility of organizing resistance. The Pacific Islanders who would become subjects of nuclear testing had none of these options. Their islands would become ground zero for weapons tests that dwarfed anything done in Nevada. Their exposure would be measured and studied with the same clinical detachment that characterized the plutonium experiments. And when the tests made their islands uninhabitable, they would be relocated to other islands and told to wait until it was safe to return, a safety that would never come. The Downwinders organized eventually. In the 1970s and 1980s, as cancer rates continued climbing and the correlations became impossible to ignore, communities formed advocacy groups. They demanded access to classified records, they filed lawsuits, they testified before Congress. Their campaign took decades. Many of the original activists died of the cancers they'd been fighting to prove were caused by the tests. But persistence and mounting evidence eventually forced the government to acknowledge what had been done. In 1990, Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. The law provided payments to individuals who could prove they lived downwind from the Nevada test site during the testing period and later developed specific cancers. The compensation was $50,000 per person. Critics noted that amount wouldn't cover the medical costs of treating radiation-induced cancer, let alone compensate for lost lives or ruined health. Supporters argued it was better than nothing, that it represented official acknowledgement of harm after decades of denial. But the Compensation Act had strict requirements. Claimants needed to prove residence in designated areas during specific time periods. They needed medical documentation of specific cancer types. Many victims couldn't meet these requirements. They'd moved away from exposure areas before diagnosis. Their cancers weren't on the approved list. Their medical records from the 1950s had been destroyed. The compensation program, designed to address the harm, ended up excluding many of the harmed. Mary Dixon qualified for compensation. Her thyroid cancer was on the approved list. She had documentation of her childhood residence in Salt Lake City. She received her $50,000 check in 1993, more than 40 years after her exposure. The money didn't change her feelings about what had been done. It didn't restore her health or erase the years of wondering why she'd gotten sick. What it did was provide official acknowledgement. Yes, you were exposed. Yes, it caused harm. Yes, the government knew and didn't warn you. The Nevada test site closed to above-ground testing in 1962 after the Partial Test Ban Treaty prohibited atmospheric nuclear tests. Underground testing continued until 1992. The site remains contaminated today. Plutonium isotopes with half-lives of 24,000 years sit in soil that will remain radioactive longer than human civilization has existed. The craters from the largest tests are visible from space, scars on the desert that will outlast the geopolitical concerns that created them. St. George, Utah, still exists. The town has grown significantly since the 1950s. New residents have no memory of the white ash, the strange sunsets, the metallic taste after detonations. But the older residents remember. They remember being told not to worry. They remember the government films in schools. They remember neighbors and family members dying of cancers that appeared in clusters too obvious to be coincidental. And they remember the decades of fighting to be believed, to be acknowledged, to be compensated for harm that could have been prevented if the government had valued their health as much as it valued nuclear weapons development. The maps that showed which communities would be exposed, that calculated expected doses in different locations, that identified children as particularly vulnerable, those maps existed before the testing began. They weren't classified because the information was uncertain. They were classified because the information was damning. The Atomic Energy Commission knew which populations would be harmed. They tested anyway. The decision to expose American civilians to radioactive fallout without warning or consent wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was policy. This policy emerged from the same logic that justified the plutonium injections, the same calculations that determined acceptable worker exposure at Oak Ridge and Hanford, the same willingness to impose risks on powerless populations in service of what authorities deemed greater goods. The Downwinders were sacrificed the same way Ed Cade and Albert Stevens were sacrificed, just in larger numbers and with more elaborate justifications. But the scale of exposure at Nevada was still limited by geography and population density. The tests were conducted in the American desert, where relatively few people lived downwind. The fallout dispersed over sparsely populated areas. The harm was significant, but contained. What happened next would show what nuclear testing looked like when conducted in places where population concerns were even less constraining, where distances were measured in ocean miles rather than desert miles, where the people exposed had no political representation and no means of seeking accountability. The Nevada test site was practice. The Pacific Proving Grounds would be the full expression of how far the nuclear weapons program was willing to go. The white ash that fell on a Utah backyard in 1951 was a warning that nobody heeded. It showed that radioactive fallout couldn't be contained, that testing would harm civilians, that the government valued weapons development more than public health. The communities downwind were the first large-scale population to be deliberately exposed. They wouldn't be the last. The testing would expand, the weapons would grow larger, and the people living in the fallout zones would discover that their bodies and their homes had been designated as acceptable losses in a conflict they hadn't chosen to participate in. And all of it was documented. The Atomic Energy Commission tracked the exposures, measured the contamination, studied the health effects. The data went into classified reports that shaped nuclear policy for decades. The knowledge was there. The choice to expose rather than protect was conscious and deliberate. When the truth finally emerged, when the maps and memos and medical studies were declassified, they revealed not incompetence or ignorance but calculation. The government knew what it was doing, it just didn't care enough about the people downwind to stop. The residents of Bikini Atoll were told they were leaving for the good of all mankind. It was February 1946, and a U.S. Navy Commodore explained to the 167 islanders that America needed their home to test atomic weapons, that the tests would benefit all people by helping prevent future wars. The Bikini people, who had lived on their atoll for generations, understood they were being asked to make a sacrifice. They agreed to relocate temporarily. The Commodore told them they could return soon. That was 78 years ago. They still haven't returned. The Marshall Islands, a scattered chain of atolls in the Central Pacific, became America's primary nuclear testing ground after the Nevada test site proved too small for the largest weapons being developed. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. Some of the weapons detonated there were thousands of times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The tests vaporized islands, created craters visible from space, and contaminated a region larger than some European countries. The first test series, Operation Crossroads in 1946, was designed as a spectacle. The Navy wanted to demonstrate atomic weapons, effects on ships, and they invited journalists, congressmen, and foreign observers to witness. They anchored 95 target vessels in Bikini's lagoon, including captured Japanese and German warships. The first bomb, called Able, was dropped from a B-29 bomber. The second, Baker, was detonated underwater. Baker created a column of water and debris that rose 6,000 feet. A mushroom cloud made of ocean spray and radioactive particles that fell back down onto the test fleet like toxic rain. The ships that survived were contaminated beyond salvage. Crews sent to decontaminate them found radiation levels so high that conventional washing and scrubbing did nothing. Some vessels were so radioactive they had to be sunk immediately. Others were towed to distant locations and abandoned. The contamination spread through the lagoon, settling into coral and sand, creating a radioactive reservoir that persists today. Bikini Atoll remains too contaminated for permanent habitation 78 years after those first tests. But Operation Crossroads was relatively small compared to what came later. The real escalation began in 1952 with the first hydrogen bomb test at Inuiatak Atoll. The bomb, called Ivy Mike, obliterated the island of Eluglab completely. The island didn't just experience an explosion on it. The island ceased to exist. Where there had been land and coral and trees, there was suddenly a crater 240 feet across, and 164 feet deep. The explosion released energy equivalent to 10.4 megatons of TNT, roughly 450 times the power of the Nagasaki bomb. The mushroom cloud rose 25 miles into the stratosphere. The Ivy Mike test demonstrated that fusion weapons could achieve yields previously thought impossible. It also demonstrated that testing such weapons in the Pacific created contamination on scales that couldn't be controlled or predicted. Radioactive debris from Ivy Mike circled the globe. Monitoring stations in Australia, India, and Europe detected fallout. The test debris contained new isotopes that had never existed in nature, products of the thermonuclear reaction that scientists studied with fascination and concern. Then came Castle Bravo. On March 1, 1954, the United States detonated a hydrogen bomb at Bikini Atoll that yielded 15 megatons, making it the most powerful nuclear weapon the United States has ever tested. Castle Bravo was supposed to yield around 6 megatons. The weapon designers had miscalculated. They'd underestimated a reaction involving lithium-7, which they thought would be inert, but actually contributed significantly to the fusion yield. The bomb exploded with 2.5 times its predicted force. The unexpected power meant the fallout spread far beyond the predicted zone. The safety exclusion area had been set assuming a 6 megaton yield. At 15 megatons, radioactive debris scattered across 7,000 square miles of ocean. The mushroom cloud rose 25 miles high and 62 miles wide. Within hours, white coral dust began falling on islands that were supposed to be outside the danger zone. That dust was intensely radioactive, contaminated with fission products and activated coral that had been vaporized and then condensed in the mushroom cloud. Rongelap Atoll was 80 miles from the test site. well outside the predicted fallout zone for a 6-megaton detonation. But with a 15-megaton yield and unfavorable wind patterns, Rongelap received heavy fallout. 64 people were living on the atoll that day. They saw the flash on the horizon, brighter than any sunrise. They heard the boom, felt the ground shake. Then, several hours later, white powder began falling from the sky. It covered everything: the ground, the trees, the water catchment systems they used for drinking water. Children played in it. People brushed it off their hair and clothes. Nobody understood what it was, or that it was dangerous. The U.S. military knew Rongelap was in trouble. Radiation monitoring aircraft detected the contamination. Ships tracked the fallout plume. But evacuation didn't begin until 48 hours after the test, after the residents had been exposed to radiation levels that caused acute symptoms. The delay wasn't logistical. Ships were available. The delay was deliberate. Declassified documents suggest that military planners wanted to study the effects of fallout exposure on a human population, and the Rongelap residents provided an unplanned opportunity. When the evacuation finally occurred, the Rongelap people were suffering from nausea, vomiting, and burns on their skin where the white powder had fallen most heavily. Children were particularly affected. They were transferred to Kwajalein Atoll, where medical teams documented their symptoms, collected samples, monitored their conditions. The examinations were thorough. The medical records detailed exposure levels, symptom progression, recovery rates. Everything was documented except informed consent. The Rongelap residents had become research subjects in a study they never agreed to participate in. The official name was Project 4.1, a classified study of the response of human beings exposed to significant beta and gamma radiation due to fallout from high-yield weapons. The project's existence wasn't revealed until decades later when documents were declassified. The medical team studying the Rongelap residents wasn't just treating radiation sickness. They were conducting research on how human bodies respond to weapons fallout. The distinction matters. Treatment focuses on the patient's well-being. Research focuses on data collection. The Rongelap people received both. But the research objectives sometimes conflicted with optimal medical care. The survivors of Rongelap developed health problems that persisted for decades. Thyroid abnormalities appeared within years. Cancer rates climbed. Some children exposed in utero were born with severe abnormalities. The medical team tracked it all, documented the correlations, published papers in scientific journals that referred to the Rongelap people by subject numbers rather than names. The research was valuable. It provided data on human radiation exposure that couldn't be obtained through ethical experiments. But the value came at a cost imposed on people who had no choice in bearing it. But here's what makes Castle Bravo's fallout even more troubling. Evidence suggests the exposure of Rongelap wasn't entirely accidental. The military had detailed weather forecasts before the test. They knew the wind was blowing toward inhabited atolls. They could have delayed the test by a day or two until wind patterns shifted. They didn't. Internal communications suggest some planners saw the unfavorable wind as an opportunity to study fallout effects on human populations at distance from the detonation. The Japanese fishing vessel Lucky Dragon 5 was also caught in the Castle Bravo fallout. The boat was 80 miles from the test site, fishing for tuna in international waters. The crew saw the flash, then hours later watched white ash fall onto their boat. They collected samples of the ash in bottles, thinking it might be valuable. When they returned to Japan 2 weeks later, all 23 crew members were suffering from acute radiation sickness. One crew member, Aikichi Kuboyama, died 7 months later from complications related to his exposure. His death created an international incident. The Lucky Dragon 5 incident forced public acknowledgement of the Castle Bravo miscalculation. The Japanese government demanded answers. International media coverage made secrecy impossible. The United States admitted the test had been larger than expected, that fallout had spread farther than predicted, that people outside the exclusion zone had been exposed. What they didn't admit was how much they'd known beforehand about the risks, or that the monitoring of exposed populations served research objectives alongside humanitarian ones. The Marshall Islanders affected by the testing program numbered in the thousands. Some were evacuated before tests and returned to contaminated islands afterward. Others, like the Rongelap residents, were exposed directly and studied subsequently. Still others received chronic low-level exposure from living on atolls where fallout had settled into soil and water. The health effects rippled through generations. Children born decades after the tests showed higher rates of thyroid disorders and developmental problems, suggesting that radiation exposure had caused genetic damage. The Bikini people, displaced in 1946, attempted to return to their atoll in the 1970s. The U.S. government declared the islands safe for habitation. Families moved back, rebuilt homes, tried to resume their lives. Then, in 1978, new studies found that radiation levels in the soil and crops were still dangerously high. The residents were evacuated again. The safety declaration had been premature, based on incomplete testing and optimistic assumptions about radiation decay rates. Today, Bikini Atoll remains too contaminated for permanent residence. The lagoon is relatively clean and has become a dive site where tourists explore the sunken ships from Operation Crossroads. But the land itself holds plutonium isotopes that won't decay to safe levels for thousands of years. The Bikini people are scattered across other islands, living in communities where they're disconnected from their ancestral lands. They receive compensation payments from the U.S. government, financial acknowledgement of the harm done, but money can't restore what was taken. Enewetak Atoll underwent a massive cleanup effort in the late 1970s. The U.S. military excavated contaminated soil, dumped it in a crater created by one of the tests, and sealed it under a concrete dome. The dome contains 73,000 cubic meters of radioactive debris. It's cracking now as climate change raises sea levels and wave action erodes its foundation. If the dome fails, radioactive material will leak into the lagoon and potentially spread across the Pacific. The cleanup was meant to be permanent. It may not last another 50 years. The scale of contamination in the Marshall Islands exceeds anything done in Nevada by orders of magnitude. The total yield of the 67 tests conducted there was equivalent to 108 megatons of TNT, roughly 7,200 Hiroshima bombs. That's enough explosive power to vaporize islands, alter ocean topography, and create contamination that will persist for geological timescales. The tests transformed the Marshall Islands from an inhabited archipelago into a radioactive sacrifice zone, a region rendered uninhabitable in service of weapons development. The testing didn't end until 1958. After international pressure forced the United States, Soviet Union, and United Kingdom to accept a moratorium on atmospheric nuclear tests. The moratorium led eventually to the 1963 Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. Underground testing continued, but the era of massive atmospheric detonations that sent radioactive debris around the world was over. The Marshall Islands gained independence in 1986, but their relationship with the United States remains shaped by the testing legacy. The Compact of Free Association provides economic assistance and gives the U.S. military access to the islands. A separate agreement established a compensation fund for individuals affected by the tests. The fund has paid out hundreds of millions of dollars, but claims have far exceeded available money. Many victims received partial compensation or nothing at all. Their losses, homes, health, community, culture, can't be adequately quantified in dollars. The Rongelap people returned to their atoll in the 1950s after being told it was safe. They developed health problems. They were evacuated again in 1985 after independent radiation testing found dangerous contamination levels. They haven't returned. The pattern repeated across the Marshall Islands: displacement, false assurances, contamination discovered too late, permanent exile. The promises that relocation would be temporary became lies not through malice, but through the stubborn reality that nuclear contamination doesn't disappear on human timescales. The medical studies of the Marshallese populations exposed to fallout continued for decades. Doctors from Brookhaven National Laboratory made annual trips to examine subjects, tracking health outcomes, documenting cancer rates, studying genetic effects. The Marshallese came to call these visits the guinea pig exams, understanding that they were being studied more than they were being helped. The doctors maintained that they were providing medical care. The Marshallese noted that the care came with extensive data collection that benefited the doctors' research careers more than the patients' health. Project 4. Once documents, when finally declassified, revealed that researchers understood they were studying a unique population that could provide data unavailable elsewhere. One memo described the Marshallese as the only population that has been exposed to such levels of fallout, noting this represented a valuable opportunity for radiation research. The language echoes the plutonium injection experiments. People transformed into research opportunities, their suffering valuable primarily for what it could teach scientists about radiation effects. The Pacific Proving Grounds demonstrated the logical endpoint of the Manhattan Project's approach to human exposure. In the secret cities, workers were exposed because informing them would compromise productivity. In the plutonium experiments, patients were exposed because voluntary subjects wouldn't be available for long-term study. In Nevada, downwinders were exposed because relocating them would be expensive and politically complicated. In the Marshall Islands, entire populations were exposed because their islands offered isolation and their political powerlessness made them convenient test sites. Each escalation followed the same logic. The importance of the mission justified the risks imposed on vulnerable populations, but the escalation also revealed the limits of that logic. You can inject 18 patients with plutonium and keep it secret. You can expose thousands of downwinders and classify the data. But you can't vaporize inhabited islands, create international incidents with Japanese fishing boats, and maintain that everything is under control. The Pacific tests were too large, too visible, too destructive to remain hidden. They forced acknowledgement of what the entire nuclear testing program had been doing, treating human populations as experimental subjects without their consent. The white coral dust that fell on Rongelap, the vaporized island of Elugalab, the cracking concrete dome at Inuiatak, these are the physical remnants of the Pacific Proving Grounds. But the real legacy is the demonstration of how far nuclear weapons programs were willing to go when freed from democratic constraints. The Marshall Islanders couldn't vote in U.S. elections, couldn't petition Congress, couldn't organize politically to resist. Their powerlessness made them perfect subjects for testing that would never have been tolerated on American soil. The contamination spread far beyond the Marshall Islands. Strontium-90 from the Pacific tests appeared in milk across the United States and Europe. Cesium-137, deposited in Arctic regions, accumulated in caribou, and eventually in the people who ate them. The atmospheric tests of the 1950s created a radioactive signature in the geological record that will be detectable for millennia. Future geologists studying rock strata will see a sudden spike in radioactive isotopes that marks the mid-20th century as clearly as mass extinctions mark the end of the Cretaceous period. But even as international pressure forced an end to atmospheric testing, even as the Pacific Proving Grounds closed and the Marshall Islanders began the long fight for recognition and compensation, the culture of exposure without consent persisted elsewhere. Back on the American mainland, nuclear workers at facilities like Hanford and Rocky Flats continued facing hazards they weren't fully informed about. The template established by the Manhattan Project, secrecy, compartmentalization, calculated risk imposed on powerless populations, didn't disappear when the atmospheric tests ended. It just adapted to new circumstances, new facilities, new populations of workers and communities whose bodies became the proving grounds for nuclear technologies. The radium dial painters of the 1920s should have been a warning. Young women working in factories painting watch dials with radium-laced paint developed mysterious illnesses. Their jaws disintegrated. Their bones became so brittle they fractured from normal movement. Some of them glowed faintly in the dark from the radium accumulating in their bodies. The companies denied responsibility for years, claiming the paint was harmless. Lawsuits eventually proved otherwise. By the time the Manhattan Project began, the dangers of radioactive materials were well documented in medical literature. The project proceeded anyway, with safety protocols that prioritized production over protection. At Hanford in the 1940s and 50s, workers called certain colleagues glowers because they set off radiation detectors even after showering and changing clothes. The plutonium had penetrated their bodies so thoroughly that external decontamination couldn't remove it. These workers continued on the job, their contamination measured and recorded but not addressed. The dosimeters they wore tracked their exposure, but the data went into files rather than informing interventions. The workers were simultaneously employees and ongoing experiments in chronic radiation exposure. Harold McCluskey earned the nickname Atomic Man after an accident at Hanford in 1976 exposed him to the highest dose of americium-241 ever recorded in a human. An explosion in a glove box where he was handling radioactive materials blew contamination throughout the room and into his lungs and bloodstream. His body contained 500 times the lifetime occupational limit. Doctors expected him to die within days. Instead, he survived 5 more years, his body studied intensively, his medical treatment secondary to the research opportunity his contamination represented. McCluskey's survival was remarkable, but his accident wasn't unique. Hanford experienced numerous contamination events over its operational lifetime. Small explosions, equipment failures, procedural mistakes, each one exposed workers to materials that their dosimeters measured but their safety protocols inadequately prevented. The accidents were documented in reports that emphasized lessons learned while downplaying harm done. The workers who survived contamination events carried radioactive isotopes in their bones for the rest of their lives, walking data points in long-term radiation studies they never consented to join. Rocky Flats, a plutonium processing facility near Denver, Colorado, operated from 1952 to 1992. Workers there handled plutonium daily, forming it into components for nuclear weapons. The work required precision and generated contamination. Plutonium dust settled on surfaces, infiltrated ventilation systems, contaminated the surrounding environment. Workers wore protective equipment, but the equipment had limits. Glove boxes leaked. Air filtration systems failed. Plutonium particles, too small to see or feel, lodged in lungs and migrated to bone tissue, where they would remain for decades. The Rocky Flats workers developed a dark humor about their jobs. They joked about glowing in the dark, about setting off radiation detectors at home, about the Rocky Flats crud that seemed to stick to everything. The humor masked genuine anxiety. They knew the materials were dangerous. The question was how dangerous, and nobody gave them straight answers. The radiation safety officers told them the dosimeters would protect them by measuring exposure. But measuring exposure isn't the same as preventing it. The dosimeters documented harm. They didn't stop it from happening. Karen Silkwood worked at the Kerr-McGee plutonium processing plant in Oklahoma. In 1974, she discovered she'd been contaminated with plutonium at levels suggesting intentional exposure rather than accidental. She was investigating safety violations at the plant, documenting shortcuts and protocol failures. Someone contaminated her apartment, her car, her food. The source was never definitively established. Silkwood died in a car accident while driving to meet a journalist with documents about the safety violations. The documents disappeared. Her contamination case became a symbol of how nuclear workers who raised safety concerns could be silenced. The beryllium workers at Y-12 in Oak Ridge faced a different hazard. Beryllium, a metal used in nuclear weapons components, causes chronic beryllium disease when its dust is inhaled. The disease destroys lung tissue progressively and irreversibly. Workers at Y-12 were told beryllium was safe if handled properly. The definition of properly proved inadequate. Ventilation systems designed to capture beryllium dust failed to account for particles smaller than predicted. Workers developed lung problems that were initially dismissed as asthma or bronchitis. Only years later, when dozens of cases emerged, did the pattern become undeniable. The Y-12 beryllium workers fought for recognition and compensation in the 1990s. They faced the same challenge as other radiation victims, proving causation. The company maintained that beryllium exposure was within acceptable limits, that the workers' lung diseases could have other causes, that no definitive link had been established. The workers knew what had made them sick. They'd breathed the dust for years. They'd seen colleagues develop the same symptoms, but individual knowledge isn't the same as proof acceptable in court or to compensation boards. The atomic veterans represent another category of exposed workers. Between 1946 and 1962, approximately 400,000 U.S. military personnel participated in nuclear weapons tests, either as observers or in exercises designed to simulate atomic warfare. Some soldiers were positioned as close as 2 miles from detonation points. After the blast, they marched through the fallout zone, experiencing radiation levels that would be considered emergency exposure today. The exercises were meant to train troops for nuclear battlefields. They also served as experiments in how soldiers would function under radiation exposure. The soldiers at Operation Desert Rock in Nevada in 1951 watched from trenches as atomic bombs detonated nearby. The blast wave knocked some of them over. The heat singed exposed skin. The light was blinding even through closed eyelids and raised hands. Then they were ordered to advance toward Ground Zero, to demonstrate that troops could operate in nuclear environments. The radiation they absorbed wasn't monitored comprehensively. Some wore dosimeters, many didn't. The military collected the data that existed but classified most of it. One veteran, Russell Jack Dan, described watching a bomb detonate from a distance of 300-500 yards. The blast threw him against the trench wall. When the order came to advance, he and his unit moved toward the crater, through dust and debris that filled their lungs. Decades later, Dan developed cancer. He applied for veterans' benefits, claiming his exposure caused his illness. The military denied his claim, stating insufficient evidence linked his specific cancer to his specific exposure. Dan spent years fighting bureaucracy, trying to prove what seemed obvious. The bomb he'd been ordered to stand near had harmed him. The pattern repeated across thousands of cases. Veterans developed cancers, applied for compensation, faced denial. The military's position was consistent. Without definitive proof that a specific exposure caused a specific cancer, benefits would be denied. But the military held the exposure records. Many veterans had never received dosimeters. Others had dosimeter readings that were lost or classified. The burden of proof fell on people who didn't control the evidence needed to meet that burden. The Atomic Energy Commission maintained dual safety standards throughout the Cold War. One set of limits was published publicly, establishing thresholds for acceptable exposure in civilian and occupational settings. A second set of limits existed in classified documents, reflecting what the Commission's own scientists believed about radiation risks. The public limits were consistently higher than the classified ones. Workers were protected according to standards that the Commission knew were inadequate, because more stringent standards would slow weapons production. This dual standard appears repeatedly in declassified documents. A memo from 1953 discusses exposure limits at Hanford, noting that the published limits allow for approximately 10 times more exposure than internal guidelines suggest is safe. The memo recommends maintaining the higher public limits to avoid disrupting operations. Another document from 1957 acknowledges that worker exposure at Rocky Flats routinely exceeds the levels that internal studies associate with increased cancer risk. The recommendation is to improve monitoring, but not to reduce exposure limits or slow production. The workers subjected to these standards trusted that the limits represented genuine safety thresholds. They believed that as long as their dosimeters showed exposure below the published limits, they were safe. The dosimeters were accurate. The limits were lies. Workers stayed within permitted exposure while accumulating radiation that the Atomic Energy Commission's own scientists knew carried significant health risks. The culture of the nuclear weapons complex encouraged workers to accept exposure as part of the job. Pride in supporting national security, loyalty to colleagues, economic necessity. All of these factors made workers reluctant to complain about safety concerns. Questioning exposure limits could mark you as unpatriotic or weak. Refusing dangerous work could cost your job. The system created pressure to accept risk without creating mechanisms for workers to challenge whether those risks were necessary or justified. Some workers did resist. They formed unions, filed complaints, contacted journalists. Their efforts were often thwarted by classification. A worker who suspected dangerous exposure couldn't prove it without access to monitoring data that was classified. A worker who developed an unusual illness couldn't establish causation without medical studies that were locked away. The secrecy that protected the weapons program also protected it from accountability to the people who built the weapons. The cleanup of former nuclear weapons sites has revealed contamination that workers were never told about. At Hanford, soil samples show plutonium concentrations hundreds of times higher than what workers were informed they were working near. At Rocky Flats, groundwater contamination extended miles beyond what was publicly acknowledged during operations. At Oak Ridge, buildings slated for demolition turned out to be so contaminated that workers dismantling them required protective equipment far more extensive than the original workers had used. These discoveries raise an obvious question. If the contamination was this extensive, what were the workers exposed to? The answer exists in files that tracked worker exposure over decades. Those files show patterns that were obvious to the administrators but hidden from the workers. Clusters of cancers among certain work groups. Higher than average rates of rare diseases. Mortality statistics that diverged from general population norms. All of this was documented, studied, and classified. The workers at these facilities built the nuclear arsenal that defined the Cold War. They processed plutonium, assembled warheads, maintained reactors, handled materials whose properties were poorly understood and whose dangers were deliberately downplayed. Some of them understood the risks they faced. Many didn't, because the information they needed to make informed decisions was kept from them in the name of national security. The dosimeters they wore became symbols of a system that prioritized measurement over protection. The dosimeters were accurate, sophisticated, carefully calibrated. They provided precise data on how much radiation workers absorbed. What they didn't provide was protection. A dosimeter that shows you've exceeded safe limits after the exposure has already occurred isn't a safety device. It's a record-keeping device. And the records it kept went into files that served the nuclear weapons program's interests far more than they served the workers' health. The workers who glowed, who set off detectors, who carried plutonium in their bones, they were living proof that the nuclear weapons program operated on a simple principle. Some people's bodies were acceptable costs for weapons development. They weren't enemy soldiers or foreign populations. They were American workers, veterans, citizens who believed they were serving their country. They were right about the service. What they didn't know was that the country they served valued their labor more than their lives, their contribution more than their consent, their willingness to work more than their right to know what they were working with. The families of these workers carried burdens too. Spouses watched partners develop mysterious illnesses, filed disability claims that were denied, sought answers that were classified. Children grew up with parents whose health declined early, whose deaths came from cancers that clustered in communities near nuclear facilities at rates that couldn't be coincidental. The families couldn't prove causation either, not definitively, not in ways that satisfied compensation boards or courts. But they knew. Everyone knew. The connection between the work and the illness was obvious to anyone who looked at the patterns. What made the workers' situation especially cruel was that many of them genuinely loved their jobs. They took pride in their work, felt honor in contributing to national defense. The plutonium processors at Rocky Flats weren't forced laborers. They were skilled technicians who believed in what they were building. The reactor operators at Hanford felt responsibility for their critical role in the nuclear arsenal. This made the betrayal sharper when they discovered that their trust had been exploited, that their dedication had been met with deception about the risks they faced. The contamination persists in their bodies and in the sites where they worked. Plutonium isotopes with half-lives of 24,000 years will outlast the Cold War, outlast the weapons they were used to build, outlast the geopolitical conflicts that justified their production. The workers who handled those isotopes are gone now, most of them, their bodies carrying isotopes to their graves, their deaths documented in studies that remain partially classified decades later. What remains is the question they couldn't answer in their lifetimes. How many bodies was the arsenal worth? Who made that calculation, and what gave them the right to impose it on people who were never asked if they agreed? The weapons built at Hanford and Rocky Flats and Oak Ridge accomplished their strategic purpose. They deterred adversaries, maintained nuclear parity, shaped international relations for half a century. But the workers who built those weapons paid a price that was never included in the strategic calculations, never factored into the cost-benefit analyses that justified the programs, never acknowledged until decades after the damage was done and couldn't be undone. The first crack in the wall of secrecy came from an unexpected source, a local newspaper in Albuquerque, New Mexico. In November 1993, the Albuquerque Tribune published a story titled, "Plutonium Experiment Done on Humans." The article revealed that patients at local hospitals had been injected with plutonium without their knowledge or consent during the 1940s. The reporter Eileen Wellsom had spent years tracking down records, interviewing survivors and families, piecing together a story that the government had kept hidden for nearly 50 years. Wellsom's investigation began with a footnote. She was researching a different story when she noticed a reference to human plutonium experiments in a declassified document. The reference was brief, clinical, easy to miss. But Wellsom was a careful reporter. She started digging. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests. She traveled to archives. She discovered that the experiments weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systematic program conducted at multiple hospitals across the country. The hardest part of her investigation was identifying the subjects. The government documents used only code designations, HP12, CAL1, CHI1. Wellsom had to match these codes to actual people, to find out who had been injected and what had happened to them. She cross-referenced hospital records, death certificates, military documents. She interviewed family members who had no idea their loved ones had been part of secret experiments. Slowly, the human beings behind the codes emerged. When the Tribune published the story, the reaction was immediate. Other newspapers picked it up. Television news covered it. Families of the victims contacted Wellsom, sharing stories of relatives who had died mysteriously, medical records that didn't make sense, questions they'd carried for decades. The government's initial response was defensive. The experiments were necessary, conducted during wartime, done with the best intentions. But the details Wellsom had uncovered made those justifications hollow. President Clinton ordered a comprehensive investigation. In January 1994, he established the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, a panel of medical ethicists, scientists, and historians tasked with uncovering the full scope of radiation experiments conducted by the U.S. government. The committee had broad authority to access classified documents, interview witnesses, and compel testimony. What they found was worse than anyone had anticipated. The human radiation experiments weren't limited to plutonium injections. Between 1944 and 1974, the government conducted thousands of experiments involving radioactive materials on American citizens. Prisoners in Oregon and Washington were exposed to testicular radiation to study its effects on fertility. Mentally disabled children in Massachusetts were fed radioactive oatmeal. Pregnant women in Tennessee were given radioactive iron. Cancer patients across the country received experimental radiation treatments far exceeding therapeutic doses, not to cure their cancer, but to study radiation's effects. Most of these experiments shared common features: vulnerable subjects who couldn't easily refuse, lack of informed consent, classification of results, and justifications based on national security or medical progress. The committee documented case after case where researchers had prioritized data collection over patient welfare, where promising medical treatments were withheld in favor of radiation experiments, where people's trust in their doctors had been exploited to turn them into research subjects. The advisory committee held public hearings where survivors and family members testified. The hearing room in Washington was often silent, except for the voices of people describing what had been done to them or their loved ones. A woman testified about her father, who'd been injected with plutonium and died never knowing why his health had failed. A man described being a child at the Fernald School, excited to join the science club, not understanding that the special breakfast they served him contained radioactive tracers. The testimonies revealed patterns that the government's fragmented record-keeping had obscured. Experiments that seemed isolated when viewed individually were actually part of coordinated programs. Different facilities had conducted similar experiments, shared methodologies, published in the same classified journals. The radiation research complex was larger and more systematic than even the committee's investigators had initially suspected. The committee also discovered that many experiments had continued long after the war ended, long after the urgency that supposedly justified them had passed. The plutonium injections extended into 1947. The Fernald School experiments ran from 1946 to 1956. The testicular irradiation of prisoners occurred in the 1960s and early 1970s. The justifications evolved from wartime necessity to Cold War competition to pure scientific curiosity, but the fundamental violation of informed consent remained constant. Some of the most disturbing findings involved children. At the Sonoma State Hospital in California, researchers exposed developmentally disabled children to radiation to study its effects on the developing brain. At the Fernald School, the Science Club experiments tracked how radioactive calcium and iron accumulated in growing bodies. These children couldn't consent meaningfully, even if they'd been asked. They were institutionalized, dependent on adults who were supposed to protect them but instead used them as experimental subjects. The committee examined the Nuremberg Code established in 1947 after the trials of Nazi doctors who had conducted experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The code's first principle is informed consent. Research subjects must voluntarily agree to participate after being fully informed of the risks. Yet American researchers continued experiments that violated this principle for decades after Nuremberg. The cognitive dissonance was addressed in internal memos that drew distinctions between Nazi experiments, intended to harm, and American experiments, intended to gather useful knowledge, as if intent mattered more than consent. In October 1995, the Advisory Committee released its final report. The document ran to nearly 900 pages, documenting experiments across 3 decades, tracking victims across the country, detailing systematic violations of medical ethics and human rights. The committee's conclusions were unsparing. Thousands of Americans had been subjected to radiation experiments without their knowledge or meaningful consent. Vulnerable populations had been deliberately targeted, and the government had known about ethical violations but failed to stop them. President Clinton issued a formal apology. Standing in the White House, he acknowledged that the government had betrayed its citizens' trust, that experiments conducted in the name of national security had violated fundamental ethical principles. The apology was significant, a rare admission of governmental wrongdoing. But apologies can't restore health or bring back the dead. The victims and their families wanted more than words. Congress expanded the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act to cover more victims. The original 1990 law had focused on downwinders and uranium miners. The expansion added participants in atmospheric nuclear tests, workers at nuclear facilities, and some experiment subjects. The compensation amounts ranged from $50,000 to $150,000 depending on the category. Applications required extensive documentation, medical records, proof of exposure. Many victims couldn't meet the requirements and received nothing. The compensation program also revealed the government's ongoing reluctance to fully acknowledge the scope of harm. Despite the advisory committee's findings, many categories of victims were excluded from compensation. The Fernald School children weren't covered. The pregnant women who'd received radioactive iron weren't included. Prisoners subjected to testicular radiation couldn't claim benefits. The exclusions seemed arbitrary, driven more by cost considerations than justice. Thanks for staying with this difficult journey through one of America's most complex moral chapters. There are more stories like this waiting in the archives. Stories that challenge what we think we know about how democracies behave in moments of crisis. I'll see you in the next one. The declassification process continued beyond the advisory committee's work. Throughout the late 1990s and 2000s, more documents emerged. Some revelations came from Freedom of Information Act requests by journalists and researchers. Others came from scheduled declassification as documents reached their age limits. Each new release added details to a picture that was already damning. One particularly troubling discovery was that some experiments had continued even after the advisory committee's investigation. Documents declassified in 2014 revealed radiation research on hospital patients that occurred in the 1970s, well past the supposed end date of the unethical programs. The experiments weren't as extensive as the earlier ones, but their existence proved that the culture of experimentation without proper consent hadn't ended when the Manhattan Project transitioned to peacetime operations. The truth that emerged from these investigations and declassifications wasn't a simple story of individual bad actors or wartime excesses. It was a systemic pattern spanning 3 decades, multiple agencies, hundreds of researchers, and thousands of victims. The system had checks and balances that failed, oversight mechanisms that were ignored, ethical guidelines that were written but not enforced. The failure was structural, not individual. What made the revelations especially painful was discovering how close the truth had come to emerging earlier. In the 1970s, congressional hearings had touched on radiation experiments but hadn't fully investigated them. In the 1980s, some documents were declassified but received little media attention. The information was available to anyone willing to dig through archives, but most people weren't digging. It took Eileen Welsom's persistent investigation to bring the story into public consciousness. The families who learned what had been done to their relatives decades after the fact faced a particular kind of grief. Not just the loss of their loved ones, but the loss compounded by years of not understanding why they'd gotten sick, of being told their suspicions were unfounded, of fighting for recognition that came too late. Some family members had spent their entire lives wondering why a parent had died young of cancer. Learning that the cancer was caused by a secret government experiment didn't provide closure, it provided anger. The survivors who were still alive when the truth emerged had mixed reactions. Some felt vindicated. They'd known something was wrong, and finally they had proof. Others felt betrayed all over again. The confirmation that their government had deliberately harmed them was somehow worse than the uncertainty had been. A few expressed a kind of grim satisfaction that the truth had finally come out, that the secrets had been too big to stay buried forever. The medical and scientific communities had to reckon with their own complicity. The doctors who conducted the experiments were often prominent researchers at prestigious institutions. Some of them were still alive when the advisory committee report was published. A few offered apologies or explanations. Most remained silent. The institutions where the experiments occurred issued statements acknowledging past wrongdoing, but institutional memory is short, and culpability is diffuse when the responsible individuals are long gone. The legacy of the radiation experiments extends into modern medical research ethics. Institutional review boards, now required for any research involving human subjects, emerged partly in response to revelations about radiation experiments and other unethical studies like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. The principle of informed consent is now central to research ethics. But the fact that these safeguards had to be created in response to violations that occurred for decades suggests that ethical principles alone aren't sufficient without enforcement mechanisms and genuine oversight. The truth that emerged wasn't complete. Documents remained classified. Some records were destroyed before they could be preserved. Victims who died early in the exposure left no testimony. The families who never learned what happened to their relatives can't seek compensation or acknowledgement. The historical record has gaps that will never be filled, silences that protect the government from full accountability even as partial truth has emerged. What the truth did reveal, unambiguously, was that the Manhattan Project and its successor programs operated on an assumption that some people's bodies were available for experimentation in service of national security. The assumption wasn't stated explicitly in policy documents. It didn't have to be. It was embedded in the structure of secrecy, in the classification of ethics concerns, in the compartmentalization that prevented oversight. in the power dynamics that made vulnerable populations into convenient subjects. The experiments, the exposures, the calculated risks imposed on unknowing populations, all of it was documented meticulously. The perpetrators weren't hiding evidence of their crimes. They were keeping records of their research. They expected their work to remain classified indefinitely, to be judged only by peers with similar clearances and similar willingness to prioritize data over consent. They didn't anticipate that 50 years later, their careful documentation would become evidence of systematic violations, that their research notes would be read as confessions. The truth emerged slowly, incompletely, painfully. It came from journalists digging through archives, from victims demanding answers, from political pressure forcing declassification, from the simple passage of time making secrets harder to maintain. The emergence wasn't inevitable. It required persistent effort by people who refused to accept official denials, who insisted that the victims deserved acknowledgement, who believed that democracies should be accountable to their citizens even for actions taken decades ago in the name of national security. And even as the truth about past experiments emerged, questions remained about present practices. What's still classified? What's still happening? The structures that enabled the radiation experiments, government secrecy, national security classifications, limited oversight of powerful agencies, those structures still exist. The assurances that such experiments couldn't happen now rely on ethical reforms and oversight mechanisms that were supposedly in place before but fail to prevent the violations. Trust is easy to demand and hard to rebuild once it's been shattered by revelations of systematic betrayal spanning decades. The truth emerged, but the reckoning remains incomplete. The victims received apologies and some received compensation, but justice for the dead is always incomplete. The institutions reformed their practices, but institutional memory is short. The documents were declassified, but more remain secret. The moral of the story should be straightforward. Democracies must not experiment on their citizens without consent. Yet the fact that this principle had to be relearned through painful revelation rather than being observed from the beginning suggests that the lesson may not be as permanent as we'd like to believe. The hardest question doesn't have a simple answer. Was it worth it? The Manhattan Project ended World War II, potentially saving millions of lives that an invasion of Japan would have cost. The nuclear arsenal, built in its aftermath, maintained the strategic balance that prevented World War III during the Cold War. These aren't small achievements. They're civilizational turning points. But they came at a price that was paid by people who never consented to bear it. Eb Cade, injected with plutonium while recovering from a car accident, never knew what had been done to him. Albert Stevens, told he had months to live, survived 20 years as the most radioactive human being who ever existed, his body studied continuously without his knowledge. The children of Rongelap, playing in white coral dust that burned their skin, grew up with thyroid problems and cancers that rippled through generations. The workers at Oak Ridge, shaking yellow uranium dust from their clothes, the families in St. George, watching white ash fall like snow, the Marshall Islanders displaced from home islands they can never return to. All of them paid costs they didn't agree to bear for weapons they didn't choose to build. The standard defense is that they were serving the greater good. Their sacrifice, however involuntary, contributed to a victory over fascism and a prevention of nuclear war. But this argument requires accepting that authorities have the right to impose sacrifice on citizens without consent, that the magnitude of the threat justifies any response, that democracy can suspend its core principles when national security demands it. These are dangerous principles. Once established, they don't limit themselves to genuine existential crises. They become templates for every future crisis, real or manufactured. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita after witnessing the first atomic test, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The quote is often interpreted as expressing moral anguish about creating such a devastating weapon. But Oppenheimer made that statement in 1965, 20 years after the Trinity test. At the time of the project, his moral qualms were quieter, more easily set aside in pursuit of the technical challenge. The reckoning came later, after the weapon had been used, after the full implications became clear. Many of the scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project experienced similar delayed reckonings. During the war, the work was urgent, necessary, justified by the threat of Nazi Germany developing atomic weapons first. After the war, when the urgency passed and the weapons proliferated, some of them regretted their contributions. Leo Szilard, one of the physicists who had originally urged Roosevelt to begin atomic research, spent his later years advocating for nuclear disarmament. Others, like Edward Teller, remained committed to weapons development, pushing for even more powerful bombs. The moral complexity doesn't resolve neatly. Yes, the bomb ended the war, but it also inaugurated an era of nuclear proliferation, mutual assured destruction, and the permanent possibility of human extinction through weapons we created. Yes, the nuclear arsenal prevented direct conflict between superpowers, but it also created proxy wars, arms races, and a global system where stability depends on maintaining the credible threat of apocalyptic violence. The Manhattan Project solved one crisis and created others that persist 8 decades later. For the victims, the moral complexity is less abstract. Ed Cade didn't benefit from ending the war faster. Albert Stevens's 20 years of unknowing participation in radiation research didn't contribute meaningfully to preventing nuclear conflict. The Marshallese children exposed to Castle Bravo fallout didn't receive any of the security benefits that justified the testing program. Their bodies became the price of weapons development, and they never had the opportunity to decide whether that price was worth paying. The question of informed consent cuts to the heart of the moral reckoning. In a democracy, government derives its legitimacy from the consent of the governed. But the Manhattan Project and its successor programs operated on the principle that some decisions were too important to require consent, that national security justified imposing risks on populations who couldn't be told what they were being exposed to or why. This creates a fundamental contradiction. How can a government claim democratic legitimacy while systematically violating the principle of consent? The standard answer is that wartime and crisis conditions require temporary suspensions of normal democratic processes. But temporary turned into decades. The Manhattan Project began in 1942. The human radiation experiments continued into the 1970s. The cleanup of contaminated sites will extend into the next century. At what point does temporary crisis measures become permanent governance by exception, where democratic principles apply only when they're convenient? The victims' fight for recognition and compensation revealed another uncomfortable truth. Acknowledgement doesn't come automatically. It requires persistent pressure from people who refuse to accept denial, who organize despite obstacles, who spend decades pushing against institutional resistance to admitting wrongdoing. The downwinders, the radiation experiment victims, the nuclear workers, they all had to fight for recognition that should have come immediately and apologetically. The compensation programs, when they finally arrived, were structured to minimize payouts. Strict eligibility requirements, high burdens of proof, arbitrary distinctions between included and excluded categories, all of these ensured that many victims received nothing. The programs provided just enough acknowledgement to claim the issue had been addressed, while limiting costs by excluding large categories of victims. This wasn't justice. It was damage control. The sites where the Manhattan Project operated remain contaminated. Hanford's cleanup costs exceed $100 billion and won't be complete for another 50 years, maybe longer. Some contamination is so deep or widespread that complete removal is impossible. Those areas will remain radioactive for thousands of years, far longer than the United States has existed as a nation. The weapons that seemed so urgent in the 1940s have created problems that will outlast the civilization that built them. Recently declassified documents from 2014 revealed experiments even the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments didn't know about. Radiation research on hospital patients that occurred in the 1970s. Programs that continued despite reforms and oversight. This suggests that the full scope of what was done still hasn't emerged, that more secrets remain classified, that the historical record even now is incomplete. The moral reckoning with the Manhattan Project requires confronting the reality that good intentions don't justify harmful actions, that urgent goals don't excuse violations of fundamental rights, that national security can't be a blank check for government to experiment on its citizens. These should be obvious principles. The fact that they need to be restated after revelations of systematic violations suggests how easily they're forgotten when authority claims the stakes are high enough. What makes the Manhattan Project's legacy especially troubling is how thoroughly it normalized secrecy and compartmentalization in government operations. Before the project, the idea of entire cities existing in secret, of thousands of workers handling materials they couldn't identify, of medical experiments conducted without any oversight, these would have seemed impossible in a democracy. After the project, they became standard operating procedure. The national security state that emerged from World War II inherited the Manhattan Project's operating principles. Classify everything, compartmentalize information, trust that authorities are acting in the public's best interest, even when the public can't know what authorities are doing. This legacy persists. Every time a government agency claims it must withhold information for national security reasons, it's invoking the precedent established by the Manhattan Project. Every time workers are told they don't need to know the full risks of their jobs, every time communities discover they've been exposed to environmental hazards without warning, the Manhattan Project's template of imposed risk and delayed disclosure is being repeated. The victims of the Manhattan Project and its successor programs wanted something simple: acknowledgement, apology, compensation. They wanted their government to admit what had been done, to express regret, and to provide some measure of restitution. These requests took decades to be partially fulfilled. Many victims died before receiving any acknowledgement. Their families received apologies on their behalf, compensation checks that arrived too late to matter. The moral reckoning isn't just about the past. It's about what we're willing to tolerate in the present and future. The structures that enabled the Manhattan Project's abuses, government secrecy, limited oversight, national security exceptions to democratic norms, those structures still exist. The assurances that such abuses couldn't happen again rest on reforms that can be reversed, oversight mechanisms that can be circumvented, ethical guidelines that aren't legally enforceable. The Manhattan Project achieved its goal. It built the atomic bomb. It ended the war. It established American nuclear supremacy. But every achievement casts a shadow. The bomb's shadow stretched across deserts and islands and hospital rooms, touching lives that history forgot. These weren't just casualties of war. They were casualties of secrecy, of the belief that ends justify means, of power making calculations about acceptable losses and imposing those calculations on people who never got to decide whether they agreed. The question that haunts the Manhattan Project isn't whether building the bomb was necessary. It's whether the human cost of building it could have been lower if the people in charge had valued transparency and consent as much as they valued secrecy and efficiency. That's a question with no easy answer, which is precisely why it matters. Because the alternative, Accepting that crisis justifies anything leads to a place where democracy becomes conditional, where rights exist only when they're convenient, where citizens serve their government rather than government serving its citizens. Eb Cade escaped from that hospital with plutonium in his bones, asserting the one power he still possessed, the power to leave. Albert Stevens lived 20 years beyond his predicted death, proving that humans are more resilient than the scientists who experimented on them expected. The Marshallese displaced from Bikini carry forward their culture, despite losing their homeland. The Downwinders organized and fought and won partial recognition. The nuclear workers who glowed in the dark left records that finally forced acknowledgement of what had been done to them. These stories don't provide easy answers about whether the Manhattan Project was justified. They force us to ask harder questions about what democracies owe their citizens, where the line is between necessary sacrifice and unjust imposition, and who gets to make those distinctions. The victims never got to make that choice. That's why their stories matter. That's why we remember. Not to condemn those who faced impossible decisions under existential pressure, but to ensure that the next time authority claims that crisis requires setting aside democratic principles, we ask harder questions about whose bodies will pay the price and whether they were given any choice in the matter. The Manhattan Project built the bomb that ended the war and ushered in the atomic age, but it also established a precedent for how democracies behave when they convince themselves that survival requires sacrifice without consent. That precedent outlasted the war, outlasted the Cold War, and persists in every classified program, every national security justification, every time citizens are told they don't need to know what their government is doing in their name. The bomb changed the world, but the secrecy that built it changed how democracies govern, and that change may be the Manhattan Project's most enduring and troubling legacy.